What if the Russian Revolution had actually failed? Here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you about how this began, because it wasn't the Bolsheviks who first brought down the Russian monarchy. It was a bread shortage in Petrograd and a Tsar who happened to be 400 miles away at military headquarters when it mattered most. In February 1917, Nicholas II, watching reports of growing unrest in the capital, sent an order to disperse the demonstrating crowds by force. His own garrison troops, worn down by years of catastrophic war losses and increasingly sympathetic to the protesters' grievances, simply refused, in growing numbers, to fire on their fellow Russians. Within days, the entire structure of Romanov authority, which had ruled Russia for over 300 years, collapsed with a speed that stunned observers on every side of the conflict. And here's the part that gets lost in the standard telling. The actual Bolshevik seizure of power, that October, the event most people picture when they think of the Russian Revolution, wasn't the revolution that toppled the Tsar at all. It came 8 months later against a provisional government that was already dangerously weak, and it succeeded with a force so small and so improvised that several serious historians studying the event have described it as closer to a coup than a mass popular uprising. Let's build the real history first, because there are genuinely two separate revolutions here, and understanding the specific fragility of each one is the key to taking this counterfactual seriously. The February Revolution that actually ended Romanov rule was driven substantially by wartime exhaustion. Russia had suffered catastrophic military casualties fighting Germany and Austria-Hungary since 1914, and by 1917, the strain on the country's food distribution and transportation systems worsened considerably by the diversion of resources and manpower toward the war effort had produced severe bread shortages in the capital, sparking demonstrations that began as a straightforward reaction to hunger and rapidly escalated into a broader political uprising once it became clear the garrison troops stationed in the capital would not fire on the crowds. Nicholas II, isolated at military headquarters and receiving increasingly desperate and contradictory reports, ultimately abdicated on March 2nd, ending over 3 centuries of Romanov rule with remarkably little organized resistance from the imperial government's own supposed loyalists. This is genuinely worth pausing on, because the actual collapse of the monarchy hinged substantially on the specific loyalty of the Petrograd garrison at this exact moment. Troops who were disproportionately composed of raw recruits and reservists rather than the more disciplined frontline units, many of whom held genuine grievances about being kept in the capital, performing what they viewed as unnecessary garrison duty rather than being sent to reinforce the actual front. A specific administrative and morale failure that made this particular garrison considerably more susceptible to fraternizing with protesters than a different unit composition might have been. Had different troops, or troops with different specific grievances and command relationships, been stationed in Petrograd at this exact moment, it's entirely plausible the February uprising is suppressed through the same kind of forceful crackdown that had successfully ended previous instances of unrest earlier in Nicholas's reign, including the 1905 revolution, which had also begun with mass demonstrations but had ultimately been contained through a combination of military force and limited political concessions that kept the Romanov dynasty in power for another 12 years. But let's set that specific hinge aside for a moment and focus on what I think is actually the more interesting and more genuinely contingent moment in this entire story. The period between February and October 1917, when Russia was governed by a provisional government that never actually consolidated stable authority, and the specific circumstances that allowed the Bolsheviks, still a relatively marginal political faction, earlier in 1917 to seize power in October. The provisional government, led for much of this period by Alexander Kerensky, faced a genuinely difficult set of structural challenges, including the ongoing and increasingly catastrophic war effort against Germany, which Kerensky's government, for a combination of ideological commitment to Russia's alliance obligations and genuine miscalculation about the army's actual remaining fighting capacity, chose to continue prosecuting through the disastrous Kerensky offensive of summer 1917, a military campaign that collapsed catastrophically and further devastated both the army's morale and the government's own political credibility with the war-weary Russian public. This decision to continue the war rather than immediately seeking peace with Germany, as many increasingly desperate Russian soldiers and workers were demanding, represents a genuine and specific hinge point worth examining, because it was this continued military failure and the accompanying economic devastation that substantially fueled the growing popular support for the Bolsheviks' simple, appealing slogan of peace, land, and bread, a message that resonated powerfully precisely because the provisional government had failed to deliver on any of these three basic demands. Had Kerensky's government instead pursued an immediate negotiated peace with Germany in the spring or early summer of 1917, rather than continuing the disastrous offensive that further devastated Russian military morale and civilian confidence in the government, it's entirely plausible the provisional government would have retained considerably more political legitimacy and popular support through the following months, denying the Bolsheviks the specific and increasingly desperate wartime conditions their eventual seizure of power substantially depended upon. The second genuinely crucial hinge involves the specific and remarkably small scale of the actual October seizure of power itself. The Bolshevik coup, which historians studying the event in detail have noted was carried out by a relatively modest force of armed Bolshevik supporters and sympathetic sailors and soldiers, succeeded substantially because the provisional government, by this point, severely weakened and increasingly isolated from popular support following the failed summer offensive and a subsequent, deeply damaging attempted military coup by General Kornilov in August, which Kerensky had been forced to rely on Bolshevik-aligned militia forces to help suppress, ironically, arming and organizing the very Bolshevik forces that would depose him just months later, had almost no remaining loyal military forces willing to actively defend it. The actual assault on the Winter Palace, the dramatic symbolic climax of the Bolshevik seizure of power, involved remarkably little actual fighting or resistance, since the palace's defenders, a small garrison including a women's battalion and a group of military cadets, had little genuine will or capacity to resist and largely surrendered or dispersed rather than mounting any serious defense. So here's the counterfactual worth building most carefully. Had Kerensky's government retained even a modest, genuinely loyal military garrison in the capital, sufficient to mount a credible defense against the Bolshevik forces attempting to seize key government buildings and communication points on the night of October the 25th, it's entirely plausible this specific coup attempt fails, just as several earlier Bolshevik-aligned uprisings and demonstrations earlier in 1917 had also been suppressed by forces still loyal to the provisional government at that point. A failed Bolshevik coup in October 1917, with key leaders like Lenin and Trotsky captured or forced back into hiding or exile, represents a genuinely dramatic alternate path for Russian history, one where the specific totalizing one-party Soviet state that actually emerged from the successful October Revolution simply never comes into being in the same form. Let's build what Russia actually looks like moving forward under this scenario, where either the February collapse of the monarchy is somehow avoided entirely, or the more historically plausible branch, where the monarchy still falls in February, but the subsequent Bolshevik seizure of power in October fails, leaving Russia under some continued form of the provisional government or a successor democratic or moderate socialist coalition. First, and most immediately, Russia's continued participation in the First World War would likely have proceeded on a considerably different trajectory, and this carries genuinely significant implications for the broader outcome of the war itself. Russia's actual withdrawal from the war following the Bolshevik seizure of power and the subsequent deeply punitive Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 allowed Germany to shift a substantial portion of its military forces from the Eastern Front to the Western Front for a final, ultimately unsuccessful offensive against French and British forces in the spring of 1918. A Russia that remains in the war, even in a weakened and increasingly war-weary state under continued provisional government leadership, would have continued tying down substantial German military resources on the Eastern Front, plausibly weakening Germany's subsequent Western Front offensive capability and potentially altering the specific timing and circumstances of the war's eventual conclusion, which actually came in November 1918 following the collapse of German military capacity and domestic political stability. Second, and this is genuinely the most consequential thread to consider, the entire subsequent trajectory of 20th century global politics, which was shaped so profoundly by the existence of the Soviet Union as a major world power and by the specific ideological and geopolitical rivalry between Soviet communism and Western capitalist democracies that defined the Cold War for the following 7 decades, simply doesn't unfold in anything resembling its actual form. A Russia that avoids Bolshevik rule, whether governed by some continued liberal democratic coalition, a more moderate socialist government, or even, in a less likely but not impossible scenario, some form of restored constitutional monarchy, represents an entirely different geopolitical entity than the Soviet Union that actually emerged, one that likely remains more closely integrated into the broader European and global economic and diplomatic system rather than pursuing the specific isolated, ideologically distinct path of Soviet development. Third, consider the human cost specifically, because this deserves direct and honest acknowledgement rather than being treated as a secondary consideration. The Soviet Union's subsequent history, particularly under Stalin's leadership beginning in the late 1920s, involved catastrophic human suffering on a scale that historians continue to study and debate in detail, including the forced collectivization of agriculture that produced devastating famines, most severely in Ukraine, killing millions of people, the extensive Gulag forced labor camp system that imprisoned and killed millions more political prisoners and perceived enemies of the state, and the Great Purge of the late 1930s, which saw hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens, including much of the country's own military and political leadership, executed or imprisoned based on often fabricated charges of political disloyalty. A Russia that avoids Bolshevik rule entirely very plausibly avoids this specific catastrophic sequence of state-directed mass violence, though it would be dishonest to suggest a continued provisional government or restored constitutional order would have avoided all forms of political violence and instability, given Russia's genuinely severe underlying social and economic tensions and the ongoing and increasingly bitter divisions between various Russian political factions that were already producing serious violence even before the Bolsheviks' actual rise to power. Fourth, think about what this does to the specific trajectory of the Second World War, since the German-Soviet relationship from the initial 1939 non-aggression pact through Germany's catastrophic invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 and the subsequent Eastern Front conflict that ultimately proved decisive to Germany's defeat, absorbing the overwhelming majority of German military casualties throughout the war, represents one of the most consequential geopolitical relationships of the entire 20th century. A non-Bolshevik Russia entering the 1930s and 1940s represents an entirely different set of alliance possibilities and strategic calculations for German foreign policy, and it's genuinely difficult to predict with confidence how the specific dynamics of the actual Second World War, so substantially shaped by the specific ideological hatred and strategic calculations both Hitler and Stalin held toward each other's regimes, might have unfolded under an entirely different Russian political configuration, though it's reasonable to suggest that many of the specific catastrophic elements of the German-Soviet conflict, driven substantially by Nazi ideology's specific targeting of both Jewish people and Slavic populations as racial enemies to be exterminated or enslaved, alongside the specific brutality of Stalin's own wartime policies, might have unfolded in a meaningfully different, though not necessarily less violent, form under a different Russian government facing German aggression. I think the honest thread to close on here is how genuinely contingent both halves of this story turn out to be under careful examination. The February collapse of the monarchy depended substantially on the specific loyalty and composition of the Petrograd garrison at one particular moment. The October Bolshevik seizure of power, the event that actually produced the specific totalizing Soviet state that shaped so much of the subsequent 20th century, depended substantially on the provisional government's own catastrophic decision to continue an increasingly unpopular war and on the specific, remarkably modest scale of armed force required to overwhelm a government that had, by that point, lost almost all capacity or will to defend itself. None of it was some inevitable unfolding of historical destiny. It was a specific sequence of military and political failures, compounding across 8 crucial months that turned a fairly marginal political faction into the rulers of the largest country on Earth. And that's usually the real shape of these hinges, isn't it? Not history's verdict finally arriving as it always had to, but a government that kept fighting a war it should have ended, and a palace guard that, when the moment finally came, simply wasn't there to defend it. We've got one more script across European history still ahead in this batch. If the fate of the 20th century hinging on a government's failure to make peace and a palace left nearly undefended is the kind of history that keeps you thinking, stick around and subscribe because there's plenty more of it still to come.